The Nexus Station's Grand Menagerie had seen many ridiculous displays of wealth and supposed sophistication over its 3-century existence. But today's exhibition promised to eclipse them all in sheer audacity. The galaxy's most prestigious exotic creature showcase hung suspended in the void between 7 star systems, a gleaming testament to the hegemony's collective delusion that anything with enough teeth, claws, or toxic secretions could be reduced to a parlor trick, given sufficient funding and arrogance. Ambassador Yulthek of the Crystalline Dominion adjusted his ceremonial breathing apparatus for the 4th time in 10 minutes. A nervous habit that betrayed his excitement despite his species' reputation for stoic composure. The invitation to witness the Valdorian Handler Guild's latest triumph had arrived on crystalline data matrices worth more than most planetary GDP figures, which should have been the first warning sign that someone was overcompensating. The Grand Menagerie's central exhibition hall stretched across 3 artificial gravity wells, its transparent aluminum walls offering an unobstructed view of the cosmic dance outside. Dignitaries from 47 different species mingled in carefully climate-controlled sections, their various atmospheric requirements separated by force fields that shimmered like oil on water. The engineering alone represented a small fortune, but then again the hegemony had never been known for restraint when it came to showing off. The Valdorian delegation stood clustered near the main containment chamber, their blue-scaled forms radiating the kind of smug satisfaction typically reserved for species who had never encountered a problem they couldn't solve by throwing more technology at it. Their Handler Guild had built its reputation on collecting the galaxy's most dangerous creatures and reducing them to docile curiosities, a business model that combined the worst aspects of a traveling circus with the ethical standards of a black market organ dealer. High Curator Bexthul raised his crest in greeting as another wave of dignitaries arrived through the station's teleportation matrix. His translator implant rendered his words in 47 different languages simultaneously, though the underlying tone of barely contained glee needed no interpretation. Honored delegates, what we present today represents a breakthrough in applied xenobiology that will reshape our understanding of Deathworld ecosystem. The term Deathworld had always struck most civilized species as typically crude human hyperbole, right up until their xenobiologists started returning from survey missions as expensive protein paste. The scientific community had grudgingly adopted the classification system after the 15th research expedition to what humans cheerfully called mildly hazardous planets failed to return any survivors capable of filing a proper report. The assembled dignitaries buzzed with anticipation, their various communication methods creating a symphony of clicks, whistles, and electromagnetic pulses that would have given a human communications officer a migraine. They had gathered to witness the impossible, a creature from Infernus 7, the legendary Deathworld, that had claimed more exploration vessels than any other single planet in known space, standing calmly in a containment field like an oversized house pet. Infernus 7 held a special place in xenobiological nightmares, a world where evolution had apparently taken a personal interest in creating the most efficient killing machines possible. The planet's native species didn't just hunt for survival, they seemed to hunt for the sheer artistic joy of it. Every ecosystem on that hellscape operated on the principle that if something wasn't actively trying to kill you, it was probably just waiting for you to let your guard down. The Valdorians had spent the equivalent of a small stellar nation's military budget on their Infernus 7 expedition, deploying technology that bordered on the theoretical and survival protocols that made intergalactic warfare look like a recreational activity. The fact that they had returned with a living specimen, rather than becoming another footnote in the planet's casualty statistics, had sent shockwaves through the Handler Guild's competitors. Ambassador Yulthek found himself studying the containment chamber's specifications displayed on nearby holographic panels. The energy requirements alone could power a modest space station, while the containment fields operated on principles that most species were still trying to understand, let alone replicate. Whatever creature lurked behind those barriers required enough technological restraint to bankrupt smaller civilizations. The anticipation in the air grew thicker than a Gorvan swamp fog as more dignitaries arrived. The ethereal collector's representatives materialized as shifting patterns of light near the chamber's eastern viewing platform, while the hive mind's delegation skittered across the walls in perfect formation, their compound eyes reflecting the containment field's glow in mesmerizing pattern. Each arriving group brought their own theories about what the Valdorians had accomplished. Some whispered about revolutionary advances in behavioral modification, while others speculated about breakthrough discoveries in predator psychology. The more pessimistic delegates simply wondered how long it would be before the creature broke free and reminded everyone why Deathworlds had earned their reputation. The chamber itself dominated the hall's center, a perfect sphere of intersecting energy fields that hummed with barely contained power. Whatever lay within remained hidden behind a swirling barrier of distorted light, though occasionally a shadow would move across the field's surface, suggesting something large and restless waited inside. Just as High Curator Bexthul prepared to begin the formal presentation, the station's arrival sensors chimed with an unexpected notification. A small diplomatic vessel had just docked at the outer ring, its registration beacon identifying it as representing a species that most delegates had relegated to footnote status in galactic politics. The humans had arrived. Their timing, as usual, was either impeccable or catastrophically inappropriate, depending on one's perspective. The human delegation's presence at such a prestigious event raised eyebrows, tentacles, and various other anatomical features across the assembled crowd. After all, humans were still considered the galaxy's newest arrivals, barely 3 centuries out of their own gravity well and possessing technology that most advanced civilizations viewed with the kind of bemused tolerance typically reserved for particularly clever. The moment of revelation was about to begin. High Curator Bexthul's ceremonial robes rippled with embedded light patterns as he gestured toward the containment chamber with the kind of theatrical flourish typically reserved for magicians, about to pull something improbably large from an impossibly small hat. The assembled dignitaries shifted their attention from the unexpected human arrival to the main event, though several continued casting curious glances at the modest delegation that had somehow earned an invitation to this exclusive gathering. The containment field's opacity began to fade with all the dramatic timing of a budget Hollywood production, revealing the chamber's contents in carefully orchestrated stages. First came the glimpse of movement, a shadow that suggested size and predatory grace. Then the outline emerged, followed by details that sent ripples of impressed murmurs through the crowd and caused more than one species equivalent of involuntary biological function. The creature that materialized before them defied easy categorization, which was precisely what made Infernus 7's wildlife so memorably lethal. Standing roughly 4 meters at the shoulder, it possessed the lean musculature of something built for sustained pursuit rather than ambush hunt. Its hide displayed the kind of adaptive camouflage that shifted between matte black and deep crimson depending on the viewing angle, while rows of serrated ridges ran along its spine like organic armor plating. But it was the creature's head that truly commanded attention. 6 eyes arranged in perfect geometric precision tracked movement with the calculating patience of something that had never known failure in the hunt. Its maw, currently closed in what the Valdorians undoubtedly considered docile contentment, housed enough dental architecture to process anything from armored vehicles to particularly slow-moving spacecraft. Ambassador Yulthek found himself recalculating his species' military preparedness against Deathworld fauna, a mental exercise that was becoming disturbingly routine since first contact with human exploration report. The crystalline Dominion's finest warforms would likely register as appetizers to something like this, assuming they could even scratch its hide before being efficiently disassembled. High Curator Bexthul basked in the crowd's awed silence like a thermal-dependent species under a binary star system. Behold the Crown Stalker of Infernus 7, apex predator of a world where survival requires not just strength, but cunning that borders on sin. For 3 standard years, our finest handlers have worked to establish communication protocols and behavioral modification techniques that render this magnificent creature as docile as any domesticated companion. The human delegation stood notably quiet during this presentation, their representative observing the scene with the kind of carefully neutral expression that experienced diplomats used when trying very hard not to laugh at inappropriate moments. The woman appeared unremarkable by most galactic standards, possessing the typical human combination of organic fragility and inexplicable confidence that had puzzled xenopsychologists for decades. To demonstrate their triumph, the Valdorian handlers began their carefully choreographed display of dominance. Neural dampening fields projected soothing frequencies while behavioral modification emitters pulsed in patterns designed to reinforce submissive responses. The Crown Stalker responded by settling into what could generously be described as a relaxed posture, though several of the more observant delegates noted that its eyes never stopped tracking potential threats around the chamber's perimeter. The first handler entered the containment field through a force barrier airlock, carrying a feeding apparatus loaded with what appeared to be several tons of processed protein. The crowd held its collective breath as the massive predator approached with movements that suggested barely restrained lethality, then accepted the offering with what the handlers clearly interpreted as grateful docility. A collective sigh of amazement rippled through the audience as the feeding demonstration concluded without bloodshed. The ethereal collective's light patterns flickered in appreciation, while the hive mind's delegation performed a synchronized dance of approval. Even the normally stoic Gorvan representatives leaked emotional pheromones that suggested grudging admiration. High Curator Bexthal preened with satisfaction as he continued the present. As you can observe, 3 years of careful conditioning have transformed one of the galaxy's most feared predators into a creature capable of peaceful coexistence with sapient life. Our techniques represent a breakthrough in xenobiological management that will revolutionize how civilized species interact with Deathworld ecosystems. The second demonstration involved multiple handlers working in coordination to guide the Crown Stalker through a series of behavioral exercises. The creature followed gestural commands, responded to audio cues, and even allowed handlers to approach its more vulnerable areas without triggering defensive responses. Each successful interaction drew more impressed commentary from the watching dignitary. What none of the spectators noticed, save perhaps for the quietly observant human representative, was the subtle tension that remained in the Crown Stalker's posture. Its compliance appeared perfect on the surface, but tiny details suggested something less than complete domestication. The way its eyes never quite focused on the handlers giving commands, the manner in which its breathing remained slightly elevated despite the relaxed positioning, the almost imperceptible tremor in its primary limbs that spoke of coiled energy waiting for release. The Valdorian handlers had mistaken patience for submission, an error in judgment that would have been instantly fatal on their specimen's homeworld. But here, surrounded by technology and comfortable in their assumption of superiority, they interpreted the creature's stillness as evidence of successful behavioral modification, rather than predatory calculation. The human delegate stepped forward as the second demonstration concluded, her movement drawing attention from several nearby ambassadors. Her approach seemed casual enough, though those familiar with human body language might have noticed the careful way she positioned herself relative to potential exit routes. "Impressive work," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic enhancement system. "I don't suppose anyone has considered what might happen if your conditioning protocols fail." High Curator Bexthal's crest rose in what his species considered polite dismissal. "Our behavioral modification techniques are based on 3 centuries of Handler Guild experience with dangerous xenofauna. The probability of systematic failure approaches mathematical impossibility." The human's smile carried just enough diplomatic courtesy to avoid giving outright offense, though her eyes remained focused on the Crown Stalker with the kind of attention that suggested professional interest. "Of course, I'm sure your expertise is quite comprehensive." As if responding to some unheard cue, the creature's head turned slightly toward the human delegation, though its movement was so subtle that most observers missed it entirely. For just a moment, 6 predatory eyes fixed on the human representative, with something that might have been recognition. The final demonstration was intended to showcase the ultimate triumph of Valdorian handling techniques, direct physical interaction between handler and predator. High Curator Bexthal announced this climax with the kind of theatrical enthusiasm that suggested he had never personally wrestled with anything more dangerous than a mildly irritated bureaucrat. The lead handler approached the Crown Stalker with confident strides, carrying specialized equipment designed to monitor the creature's biometric responses during direct contact. The assembled dignitaries leaned forward in their various atmospheric sections, anticipation thick enough to cut with most species' eating implement. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan, which should have been everyone's first warning that something was about to go spectacularly wrong. The lead handler's confidence remained unshakable as he activated the biometric monitoring equipment. Its sensors designed to track everything from neural activity to metabolic fluctuations in real time. The data streams projected holographically above the containment chamber showed exactly what 3 years of behavioral conditioning had promised: an apex predator operating at baseline relaxation levels, its threat assessment protocols apparently dormant. High Curator Bexthal gestured grandly toward the readouts, his crest flaring with pride. As you can observe, our subject exhibits no signs of aggressive preparation. Heart rate equivalent, stress hormone production at minimum thresholds, neural activity consistent with docile contentment. The Crown Stalker has been fundamentally reprogrammed at the neurochemical level. The human representative chose that moment to clear her throat, a sound that somehow carried more ominous weight than it had any right to possess. Before you proceed with direct contact, perhaps I could offer some insight about Deathworld predator behavior. Several delegates turned toward her with expressions ranging from polite curiosity to barely concealed condescension. The Valdorian handlers paused in their preparations, though their body language suggested they were merely humoring a primitive species' concerns rather than acknowledging any genuine expertise. Human perspectives are always welcome, High Curator Bexthal replied with the kind of diplomatic courtesy typically reserved for small children offering to help with complex engineering projects. Though I should mention that our understanding of predator psychology has been refined through centuries of practical application. The human stepped closer to the containment field, her movement drawing the Crown Stalker's attention with an intensity that should have set off every alarm in the facility. 6 predatory eyes locked onto her position with laser-like focus, though the biometric readings remained frustratingly stable. She studied the creature for several long moments before speaking. "The thing about apex predators from Deathworlds," she said, conversationally, "is that they don't actually get domesticated. They just get bored." Before anyone could fully process this statement, she continued in a language that most of the assembled delegates had never heard before. The sounds that emerged from human vocal cords seemed impossible. A series of growls, clicks, and subsonic rumbles that bypassed the universal translators entirely and struck directly at something far more primitive than conscious thought. The effect on the Crown Stalker was immediate and catastrophic. Every biometric alarm in the containment system screamed simultaneously as the creature's relaxed posture exploded into predatory readiness. Heart rate spiked beyond the monitoring equipment's measurement thresholds, while stress hormones flooded its system in concentrations that should have been biologically impossible. Neural activity patterns shifted from docile contentment to something that the computers could only classify as extreme tactical assessment mode. The lead handler barely had time to register surprise before 6 tons of perfectly evolved killing machine launched itself toward his position with the kind of acceleration typically reserved for military interceptor craft. The containment field, designed to restrain a docile creature rather than an actively motivated apex predator, held for exactly 1.7 seconds before catastrophic system failure rendered it as effective as tissue paper in a hurricane. Chaos erupted with the kind of efficiency that suggested the universe had been waiting for this moment with poorly concealed anticipation. The Crown Stalker burst from its containment sphere, trailing fragments of exotic matter and the shattered remains of 3 centuries worth of Handler Guild arrogance, its roar echoing through the chamber with enough acoustic force to crack several of the weaker atmospheric barriers. Ambassador Yulthek found himself questioning several fundamental assumptions about galactic civilization as he watched the creature move through 3-dimensional space with the fluid grace of something that had never encountered an environment it couldn't navigate. His species' traditional diplomatic protocols had no provision for apex predator encounters, an oversight that seemed increasingly problematic as the situation developed. The Valdorian handlers scrambled for their emergency containment equipment with all the coordination of a comedy troupe attempting synchronized swimming. Their backup systems, designed for gradual behavioral regression rather than complete systematic failure, proved about as effective as treating a stellar collapse with positive thinking and improved nutrition. The Crown Stalker's attention remained fixed on the human delegation, with single-minded intensity that suggested something far beyond ordinary predatory interest. It moved through the fleeing crowd with surgical precision, avoiding other species entirely, while maintaining direct focus on its apparent target. The creature's behavior patterns indicated not random aggression, but purposeful hunting, though what it intended to hunt remained terrifyingly unclear. The human representative stood calmly in the face of approaching doom, her posture suggesting either remarkable bravery or complete detachment from reality. As 6 tons of evolutionary perfection closed the distance between them, she continued speaking in that impossible language, her words seeming to affect the creature's movements in ways that defied every principle of xenobiological science. Rather than attacking, the Crown Stalker slowed its approach, its predatory focus shifting to something that looked disturbingly like recognition. The creature's massive head tilted at an angle that suggested consideration rather than aggression, while its previously elevated biometric readings began displaying patterns that the monitoring equipment couldn't interpret. Station security forces arrived with the kind of precise timing that guaranteed maximum dramatic impact and minimum practical effectiveness. Their containment weapons, designed for subduing ordinary dangerous fauna rather than Deathworld apex predators, proved roughly as useful as throwing party decorations at a stellar storm. The Crown Stalker ignored their efforts with the casual dismissal typically reserved for particularly persistent insects. The human turned toward the security forces, raising one hand in a gesture that somehow conveyed authority despite coming from a representative of what most species considered a minor galactic power. "Stand down," she said in Galactic Standard, her voice carrying an odd note of command. "It's not aggressive." This statement struck most observers as the kind of optimistic assessment typically offered by individuals whose grip on objective reality had become somewhat tenuous. The Crown Stalker had just demolished the galaxy's most advanced containment system, scattered some of the sector's most influential diplomats, like startled prey animals, and was currently standing close enough to the human delegation to conduct detailed anatomical surveys with its primary sensory organ. Yet somehow, impossibly, the creature remained motionless, except for what appeared to be some form of communication attempt directed specifically at the human representative. Its massive head moved in patterns that suggested meaning, while subsonic vocalizations created harmonics that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to neurological structures most species preferred to keep deeply buried. The human responded with more of those impossible sounds, her vocal range apparently extending well beyond normal biological parameters. The conversation, if it could be called that, continued for several minutes while the assembled delegates watched in fascination, mixed with the kind of existential horror that comes from witnessing fundamental assumptions about reality undergo rapid and violent revision. High Curator Bexthal's crest had flattened completely against his skull, a display of submission his species typically reserved for encounters with natural disasters or tax auditors. His 3 years of careful behavioral conditioning lay in ruins around the chamber, along with his professional reputation and most of the Valdorian Handler Guild's credibility. The Crown Stalker completed whatever communication it had been attempting and settled back onto its haunches, adopting a posture that could charitably be described as relaxed attention. Its 6 eyes remained fixed on the human representative, but the quality of its focus had shifted from predatory assessment to something that looked disturbingly like expectation. The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of emergency containment fields being hastily erected around the chamber's perimeter, and the quiet sobbing of several diplomatic officials, whose understanding of galactic power structures had just undergone catastrophic recalibration. The human finally turned back toward the assembled crowd, her expression carrying the kind of patient resignation typically exhibited by teachers about to explain something very basic to students who really should have known better. "Perhaps," she said with devastating mildness, "we should discuss what actually happened here." The emergency containment protocols had transformed the Grand Menagerie's exhibition hall into something resembling a maximum security detention facility designed by committee, which is to say it was impressively expensive and functionally useful. Force barriers hummed at every conceivable angle while security drones buzzed overhead like mechanical insects with authority complexes, their sensors trained on a Crown Stalker that appeared to be enjoying the attention with the satisfied air of a performer who had just delivered their best routine. Ambassador Yulthek found himself occupying the uncomfortable position of senior diplomat at what had rapidly evolved from a prestigious cultural event into a first-contact incident with potentially catastrophic political implications. His crystalline biology was not equipped to handle this level of stress, and he could feel hairline fractures developing in his exoskeleton that would require expensive repairs once this nightmare concluded. High Curator Bexthal had retreated to what he clearly hoped was a safe distance, though given that his understanding of dangerous creature behavior had proven spectacularly inadequate, his positioning choices carried roughly the same reliability as weather predictions on a quantum storm front. His ceremonial robes had lost most of their embedded light patterns, leaving him looking rather like a deflated party decoration with authority issue. The human representative appeared entirely unperturbed by the chaos surrounding her, standing within comfortable conversation distance of a creature that had just redefined everyone's understanding of the phrase contained. Her casual proximity to 6 tons of apex predator suggested either remarkable courage or a fundamental disconnect from basic survival instincts that most species considered essential for continued existence. "The first thing you need to understand," she began, addressing the assembled delegates with the patient tone of someone explaining basic physics to particularly slow students, "is that Infernus 7 isn't actually a death world. It's just a world where everything evolved to survive alongside humans." This statement landed in the diplomatic gathering with roughly the same impact as announcing that gravity was actually optional and had been operating on the honor system all along. Several species translation matrices struggled to process the concept, producing error messages that suggested their linguistic protocols had encountered something beyond their theoretical parameter. The Crown Stalker chose this moment to demonstrate its opinion of the containment efforts by casually extending one claw toward the nearest force barrier. The exotic matter field, designed to restrain creatures operating under normal biological limitations, parted like morning mist before the casual application of precisely applied pressure. The gesture appeared almost dismissive, as if the creature was politely declining an invitation to remain imprisoned. "You see," the human continued, apparently unbothered by this casual display of technological superiority, "what your handler guild accomplished wasn't domestication. They successfully created the most bored apex predator in galactic history." Security Chief Naldrak, whose species had evolved from persistence hunters and should have recognized predatory behavior when it demolished their containment systems, activated his emergency communication array with trembling appendages. "Station Command, we need immediate evacuation protocols and military intervention. The situation has exceeded all containment parameters." The human raised an eyebrow, an expression that somehow conveyed more authority than the security chief's arsenal of exotic weaponry. "That won't be necessary, though you might want to check your personnel files for anyone who's had extended exposure to Deathworld environment." This suggestion sent ripples of unease through the crowd as several delegates began performing rapid mental calculations about their staff's exploration history. The implications were disturbing enough without adding the possibility that their own personnel might share whatever inexplicable connection the human had demonstrated with the escaped predator. "The Crown Stalker wasn't docile," the human explained, settling into what appeared to be a lecture posture that suggested she was just getting started. "It was waiting. You see, on Infernus 7, everything that survives does so by learning to coexist with the dominant species, and humans have been the dominant species there for about 15,000 years. Ambassador Yulthek's translator implant produced several error notifications as it attempted to process this information. Humans had been a spacefaring species for barely 3 centuries, and their technological development suggested a civilization that had achieved interstellar capability through determination rather than advanced evolution. The timeline didn't match any existing xenoarchaeological model. High Curator Bexthul found his voice, though it carried the strained quality of someone whose worldview was undergoing rapid and unwelcome reconstruction. "Impossible. Human exploration records indicate first contact with Infernus 7 occurred only 47 standard years ago." "First official contact," the human corrected with a smile that suggested the distinction was more important than most people realized. "Humans have been crash-landing on hostile worlds and figuring out how to survive long enough to evolve alongside the local wildlife for considerably longer than that. We just didn't think it was worth mentioning in our diplomatic introduction." The Crown Stalker demonstrated its opinion of this conversation by settling into a position that could charitably be described as relaxed attention, though its 6 eyes remained fixed on the human with the kind of focus typically reserved for pack members awaiting instruction. The creature's postures suggested familiarity with this type of interspecies communication, as if such conversations were routine rather than unprecedented. "What you're seeing," the human continued, "is a predator that spent 3 years in captivity waiting for someone to speak its language. Crown Stalkers are social hunters on Infernus 7. They work in partnership with human settlements, providing protection in exchange for territory management and prey coordination. Your handlers managed to capture an individual that had been separated from its human partner.
This revelation struck the assembled diplomats with the force of discovering that their expensive security systems had been designed by the same species they were meant to protect against. The implications cascaded through political, military, and commercial considerations, with the kind of efficiency that suggested the universe enjoyed creating uncomfortable realization. Security Chief Naldrak lowered his weapons array slowly, his tactical assessment protocol struggling to process a situation where the perceived threat had transformed into something resembling a diplomatic misunderstanding with teeth. Are you suggesting that this creature domesticated by your species? Not domesticated, the human replied, scratching absently behind one of the Crown Stalker's auditory organs with the casual familiarity of someone who had performed this gesture countless times before. Partnership, mutual benefit. Crown Stalkers get organized territory and reliable food sources. Humans get protection from things that make Crown Stalkers look cuddly. The creature's response to this attention was a sound that bypassed the universal translators entirely, and spoke directly to neurological structures that most species preferred to keep safely buried. It was the kind of vocalization that suggested contentment mixed with mild reproach, as if the Crown Stalker was pointing out that 3 years of Handler Guild hospitality had been a poor substitute for proper interspecies etiquette. The Handler Guild's behavioral modification techniques, the human observed with clinical detachment, were essentially elaborate methods for making a highly intelligent predator extremely irritated while preventing it from expressing its displeasure effectively. You're fortunate that Crown Stalkers are patient by nature. High Curator Beckstuhl's crest had achieved maximum flattening, a display that his species typically reserved for encounters with cosmic-level disasters or annual performance reviews. But the biometric readings showed complete docility. 3 years of successful conditioning. 3 years of a creature smart enough to recognize that cooperation was more likely to result in eventual freedom than resistance, the human corrected. Crown Stalkers can maintain tactical patience for decades if the situation requires it. Their persistent predators adapted to hunting prey that can think tactically. The assembled delegates began experiencing the kind of existential recalibration that typically accompanied the discovery that fundamental assumptions about reality had been operating under false pretenses. The galactic hierarchy, with its careful classifications of primitive and advanced species, suddenly seemed less like objective assessment and more like dangerous oversimplification. Ambassador Yulthek finally managed to formulate a coherent question, through his species' mounting horror. How many other worlds that we've classified as deathworlds are actually human colonies? The human's smile carried implications that would require several diplomatic conferences, and possibly military restructuring to fully address. Well, that depends on how you define colony versus place where humans ended up and decided to stay, but I'd estimate somewhere between 15 and 20% of your current Deathworld classification. The Crown Stalker chose this moment to demonstrate its opinion of continued captivity by standing and stretching with the kind of casual power that suggested containment had always been voluntary. Its movement sent security personnel scrambling for positions that might charitably be described as strategically distant, while the creature regarded their panic with what appeared to be amused tolerance.
I think, the human said, watching the security response with mild interest, we should probably arrange transportation back to Infernus. My colleague here has been away from home long enough, and I suspect your Handler Guild has learned everything they're going to learn from this particular research project. As if to emphasize this point, the Crown Stalker padded over to the chamber's main viewing portal, and gazed out at the stars with the unmistakable posture of someone contemplating a very long journey home. The gesture was so fundamentally familiar, so recognizably universal, that it cut through species barriers and translation protocols to communicate something that needed no interpretation. The Grand Menagerie's exhibition had succeeded beyond all expectations, though not quite in the manner the organizers had intended. They had wanted to display the triumph of civilization over nature, the superiority of technology over evolutionary adaptation, and the galaxy's collective mastery over the dangerous unknown. They had accidentally revealed that the dangerous unknown had been quietly managing galactic affairs from the beginning, and that humanity's reputation for surviving impossible situations wasn't due to luck or determination so much as 15,000 years of practice at making friends with things that could eat starships. The cleanup was going to require considerably more than emergency containment protocol chat control.